Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I knew I was going to need a drink of water, so I asked the stage crew, because there's 2 cups of water up here, I said, well, which cup of water is mine? And Tony from the stage crew looked at me and said, well, whichever one's fuller. They're both about the same. Appreciated the choir. I've appreciated them through the whole feast. Thank you, one and all. It really adds a lot to the service. And another great weather day. I mean, even a mediocre sight with the weather we've been having would be good. A great sight with the great weather we're having is a home run. So we really appreciate that. One of the activities my wife and I enjoy, we like to go to the movies, the movie theater. Because we go to the theater with the really comfortable reclining seats and they bring you food if you want it. And it's a nice time for us when we can find something worth seeing. Now, we all know what that's like. Some things just aren't worth seeing, and some things you do see, well, maybe they could have been better. Some things are okay, and some movies are great. And when you see a great movie, you just hate to see it end. You just wish there was more. So sometimes I have stayed in my seat and watched the closing credits a little bit just to collect myself. And on a number of occasions, and I guess part of it was curiosity and part of it was not wanting the movie to end, I watched them all the way to the end. And I mean all the way to the end. So I'm curious, have any of you ever watched the closing credits of a movie all the way to the end? Okay, a reasonable number. I don't feel weird anymore. But, excuse me. But you know how it works. And for those of you who never have, it kind of works. The credits come on and they acknowledge the people who are responsible for making the movie, the producers, the director. And then it moves on to the starring roles, the more prominent roles. And then it continues to roll, and it goes down to supporting roles and subordinate roles. And it keeps going, and then it reaches a transition point. And at that transition point, the characters stop having names. They're not described by names anymore. Not that they don't have a name, but we don't know them because they're not listed. They're listed by what their function is in the movie. Like bartender played by so-and-so, or cab driver played by this person. So what I want to do, I want to take that template and I want to lift it off of a movie and lay it on the Bible. And we'll look at it briefly. And of course, who's responsible for the Bible but God and Jesus Christ? So they're at the top billing. And then you have the main characters with prominent roles like Abraham, Noah, Moses, David, the apostles. And then you go to a little lower tier. They still have names, maybe the kings of Israel, the prophets. But what I want to do, I want to go down past where they have names. I want to look at a couple of people today who we don't know their names, because we have something to learn from them too, and they also have a part to play. And in some cases, they have just as big a part to play as the characters we're very familiar with. Now, it's good that we're familiar with those characters, because it's meant to be that way. We're meant to know them. They're there for examples for us, both good and bad. In fact, we know them so well that it almost seems like we know them personally. So let's look at some of the less known characters. And the first one I'd like to start with, we meet him in John 9. And we meet him because he interacts with Christ and the disciples. In John 9, verse 1, it says, "Now as Jesus passed by, he saw a man who was blind from birth." Now, before we go any further, let's just stop for a moment and consider what life was like for this man. He'd been blind from birth. What does that mean? That means no tag, no hide and go seek, no throwing and catching games, no doing what we take for granted. I mean, I can see the ocean sparkling right here, and it's just pleasing. He never experienced that. He never experienced a lot of what we experienced in childhood. He suffered. He suffered. And his disciples passing by asked him, saying, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Now, how did they know he was born blind? Well, maybe they asked him, but maybe they saw him there over the years as they had gone up to the temple to worship. And there he was standing, begging, first a little guy, and then an older, and now teenager. I'm guessing from the limited information we have, maybe between 12 and 20 in that neighborhood. They say, who sinned, this man or his parents? Because this seems so unfair. Somebody had to have sinned. Jesus answered and said, neither this man nor his parents sinned, but that the works of God should be revealed in him. Wow. That's quite a statement. So this tells us that there's something big going on here. So Jesus, as we know in the story, he heals him. He gets down, he spits on the ground, he makes some clay, he spreads it over his eyes, and he goes and he says, go wash in the pool of Siloam. So think about this now. This man has been blind from birth. Everybody knows him. And now, I don't know if he was able to find his way there himself or he was led, but he's on his way to the pool of Siloam, and his eyes have, everybody's attention is attracted to his eyes. Off he goes. He washes in the pool of Siloam, which John tells us means sent, so there's some symbolism there. And he's healed. He's healed. He can see. And what a great miracle. What a great miracle. Of course, the religious authorities did not agree. This was a Sabbath day that he healed, so right away they were a little miffed because he healed on the Sabbath. Now, it's hard to tell, can't tell definitively from Scripture whether this was the eighth day Sabbath or whether it was a weekly Sabbath immediately following the eighth day. Personally, I'm in kind of the eighth day camp because of what this pictures. Because prior to doing this, Jesus was in the temple with his disciples teaching that he was the light of the world. He was the light of the world, and he gave this man sight. Now, if we read down further on, the people are saying, this is amazing, because not since the beginning of the world has anyone blind from birth been healed. This seems to have been a miracle reserved for the Messiah, an irrefutable sign of who the Messiah was. No one had ever done that. Now, we tend to think sometimes that, if you're able to bring someone back to life from the death, that's a great miracle. It is a great miracle, but you're bringing them back to life as it was. But if you think about this, healing the blind, then when you're brought back to life, you have a different quality of life, because we know blindness is spiritual. And I don't know if you've ever thought about it, but how do you go about healing someone who's blind? You heal their eyes. That's not enough. You have to heal their minds. There's something that transpired earlier that Mark records in chapter 8, and Jesus heals another blind man there. He does it in private, though, because it's not yet his time. And he also uses saliva, puts it on his eye, and he says, what do you see? And the man says, well, I see people walking around like trees. And then Jesus touches him again, and he says, now what? He says, now I can see. So I don't know exactly what went on there, but it makes me think maybe Jesus healed his eyes first and then healed his mind. Because a person who's blind from birth, their mind has to interpret what they're seeing, and they have no experience in it. So to heal someone's sight from birth, you have to seal their mind. And this is an example of what Christ came to do as the Messiah. He came to heal our sight because we were blind, and he came to heal our minds. It is a great miracle. And dropping down to verse 35, because this young man was getting some flack from the religious authorities that keep asking him, are you sure you were born blind? And they ask his parents, are you sure he was born blind? Because if he was born blind, then this is a sign that cannot be refuted. You have to refuse the sign, which we see they did, and Jesus kind of chastises them for it. But I do think this young man became a believer, and honestly, in spite of his earlier life, he seems none the worse for wear, because when he's being questioned, it seems like he almost gets a little cocky, because he says, why are you asking me all these questions that you're curious about this fellow? Do you want to become disciples too? And then they kick him and his parents out of the synagogue. But this is a powerful witness of Christ as the Messiah. And this young man went through a lot in order to do it, because he had to be blind from birth to establish the credibility that Christ is the one who heals the blind that don't have any hope. So let's take a look at another person whose name we don't know. We read about him in Mark 5 and Luke 8. Now, Matthew 8 lists two men, but I'm just going to go with Mark's account in verse 5 of one man. Mark 5, verse 1. Now they came across the Sea of Galilee, Jesus and his disciples, and they came to the country of the Gadarenes. It's confusing because there's two names here, but it obviously is on the coast of what we know as the Decapolis. And the Decapolis was a Gentile area. Jews did not go there because they were unclean. They looked down on the Gentiles, and this was a big Gentile area. It says in verse 2, when he had come out of the boat, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit, who had his dwelling among the tombs, and no one could bind him, even with chains. He would break the shackles off and pull the chains apart. No one could tame him. And night and day he was in the mountains and in the tombs, crying out and cutting himself with stones. When he saw Jesus, he ran and worshipped him. Kind of odd. And he cried out with a loud voice and said, "What have I to do with you, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I implore you by God that you do not torment me." Because he had an unclean spirit. And Jesus said to him, come out of the man, unclean spirit. And he asked him his name. He said, my name is Legion, because there we are many. Of course, they asked him to not send him to outer darkness, but allow them to go into the swine, which then ran down the hill into the ocean and basically committed swine suicide. We all know Mr. Clean, right? Procter & Gamble's icon. This man was Mr. Unclean. He was a Gentile. He lived among the tombs, so contact with dead bodies and dead things made you unclean. He was possessed by a demon. But Jesus crossed the Sea of Galilee to heal this man. Jesus is showing his disciples here that he has power over the demons. He has power over the unseen realm and the spirits that inhabit it. He is Lord of all. Remember how the unclean spirit came down and worshiped him? The disciples saw this, and this made an impression. And this man had to deal with a lot through his life. Doesn't say how long this happened, but he had quite a reputation, apparently. And after Jesus healed him, the man said, "Can I follow you?" And Jesus said, "No, what I want you to do, I want you to go back home and tell people what has just happened." So this man had an idea how he wanted to serve Christ, but Christ told him how he wanted to be served, and this man did that. And we see over in Mark 7 that when Jesus came back through the Decapolis again, that he was able to heal people. There were seeds of faith that were sown by this man, so Jesus could do a work and preach the gospel in this Gentile region. Because after all, Jesus is the light of the Gentiles. And this is the beginning of that. So I have one more example. And we read about her also in Mark 5 and Luke 8. And this is down in Mark 5, verse 24. Jesus is on his way to the house of Jairus to heal his daughter. And there's this inserted story of a woman who had a flow of blood for 12 years. Her menstrual cycle didn't stop. She kept menstruating for 12 years. Imagine what that was like. If that wasn't bad enough, she had the misfortune of living in a culture where she would be considered unclean. What does that mean? It means people don't want you around because you might make them unclean. It means you never get invited to dinner. It means people can't have contact with you. So she was a social pariah for 12 years. Imagine what that would do to a person psychologically. This was not an easy thing for her. For 12 years. It says she spent her entire fortune on the physicians trying to solve this, trying to get her healed. Think she entreated God during this time? I think probably she did. She does seem to know the scriptures. So she hears about this rabbi, and she thinks he's the Messiah. If I can get to him, I can be healed of this. But I can't just walk up there in the crowd and say, "Rabbi, I have this problem," and incite a riot. So she decides to do it stealthily. But there might be more to it than that. There might be more to it. If you want to go to Malachi 4. Malachi 4, beginning in verse 2. Well, actually, it begins in verse 1. This is a messianic prophecy centered around the day of the Lord. So I believe, because why else would you think, if I can just go and touch his garment, I can be healed? I mean, that's a little outside of the norm. But maybe she knew this prophecy in Malachi 4:2. Malachi 4:2 says, "But in my name the Son of Righteousness shall arise with healing in his wings, and you shall go out and grow fat like stall-fed calves." Now, what's the imagery that we think of with this? Well, the sun arises with healing. Back in Pennsylvania, before the feast, my wife and I, we refused to turn our heat on before, and there's been some cold mornings. So we go into the family room to read and do our puzzles in the morning, and we sit by the window where the light comes in. And the rays of the sun's light feel wonderful. Well, this is the Son of Righteousness. This is an allusion to the Messiah. And he has healing in his wings, or some translations have extremities. Now, we don't speak Hebrew. But if we spoke Hebrew, we would know that this word for wings also refers to the hem or corner of one's garment. I believe she knew this and went to get healed. And we know the story. She snuck up behind him and she touched him. And this is the only place that we ever have a healing like this. It's not like he willed her to be healed. He didn't even know it at first. He felt the power or the, what do they call it? Essence go out of him, and she felt healed immediately. Immediately. So it wasn't so much about him healing her as it was about her faith to be healed. Because her faith is the thing that drove this. Now, obviously, Christ was pleased with her faith, and only too happy to have this happen. But it shows us a little something about having faith going to Christ. What an example of faith to endure all that, to be willing to risk humiliation in a public setting to be healed by the Messiah. And over in Mark 6, we find out that this was kind of a thing then. I don't know if she started it or they all realized this prophecy, but other people went up and touched his garment to be healed. So this became something that people did. So she knew getting him to him would be difficult, but she persevered in faith. And she was healed while at the same time providing a witness that Jesus, again, is the Messiah. So what do all three of these examples have in common? Well, all three of these people suffered. And they suffered for some time, just not a week or two. Years. Some lifetimes, maybe. But they had to suffer for a period of time in order to establish credibility as witnesses. Another thing, God didn't check with them first to see if they were okay with it. He didn't give them a choice regarding their circumstances. Now, I'm sure in hindsight, any of us would say, oh, yeah, I'm glad I was able to help out in this way. But it's a little different looking ahead from where you start and having to go through this. The point is God chose their circumstances in order to manifest his glory. They didn't choose for themselves their circumstances. God placed them where he wanted them. Now, there was something bigger going on here than just the healing of these three individuals. While that was great for them, and I believe all three of them became followers, but God used their suffering so he could show his power and glory. Because all three of these were not simply healed for their own benefit, but as examples of God's loving kindness. These examples carry right down to this day, right here, right now. And in so doing, they actually became participants with Christ in preaching the gospel. Now, often when we find ourselves in a trial, we look for a reason, and of course, this is normal. And it's right, because truth be told, sometimes we bring trials on ourselves. So we always want to be a little circumspect, but that's not always the case. Sometimes we don't bring the trials on ourselves, they come, even though we might not want that to happen. Now, we know the trial of our faith works patience, but sometimes we might not consider, while we're in the midst of the trial, whether it's our own making or not, that we're affecting others by this. Others are watching and seeing how we react. What makes a credible witness? A witness who will follow God when to others, there doesn't seem to be any material benefit to it. Remember Job and Satan? Does Job fear God for nothing? Look at what you've done for him. You made him the richest man in the East. There's some truth to that. A credible witness. Someone who patiently endures and continues in doing good because God says it's good, even though there appears to be no benefit materially or financially. God has called us to participate with him in his good work. What has he asked of us? What might he ask of us? We don't know what the immediate future holds. Historically, those who were part of preaching the gospel did not have an easy road. And we know that the scripture tells us things are going to get worse before they get better. So how can we, who are participating with God in this work, with Christ in his work, how can we be steadfast witnesses for the gospel when conditions aren't that good? To help others see what God has done for us when it doesn't appear to have a reward. Well, part of that answer involves what we're doing here at the feast. Not just because we're observing it, but God's festivals have multiple layers of meaning. And this festival is a powerful reminder to help us endure. Like those who have gone before us, reminding us to have faithful endurance in the face of adversity. One layer of this festival is the hope that the good things of God's kingdom on earth are surely coming, and they surely are. Something we all look forward to with great anticipation. The hope or earnest expectation of our future is something that we will need to sustain us through the hard times that we're all going to experience at one point or another. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that because others have or will expound on that. The layer that I want to talk about is about the aspect of the booth. After all, this is the Feast of Booths. What's a booth? Well, to the nation of Israel, it was a tent. They lived in tents. Why tents? Tents afford mobility. They were moving. They were not staying. They were going somewhere, and they needed to be mobile. They were on their way to someplace else, a place other than where they were presently. Shows that their journey was temporary, and it had an end, an outcome. Now, all that we see and experience around us is temporary. It will go back to dust. This festival reminds us that the only permanence we can have is yet to come. The journey will eventually end, but after our journey is complete, we will have arrived in the true promised land, God's everlasting kingdom. Now, it's easy to think that this is all academic. We know this already. Why the exercise here? Why the object lesson? Well, I think God knew there was something of value in acting it out, living it. Kind of like an object lesson, as I mentioned. Life has a way of diverting our attention onto itself. I get it. I remember very well how hard it was to leave my job to go to the feast. I think out of 44 years of doing it, 2 years were easy, like the last 2, probably because I was getting close to retiring and didn't care so much. But upon returning, I always felt better. I felt recentered, and I'm glad I did it. And it's also it's important to remember that all the trials we experience in this life are also temporary. Ecclesiastes 3 is a time for every purpose, a season for every purpose under heaven. A time to be born, a time to die, good times, bad times. They're seasons. They pass. Seasons pass from one to another. There, I don't know, something came up on my iPad. Wanted me to know if I wanted internet. Not really. Not now. All seasons pass from one to another, and eventually they pass completely. Notice 1 Peter 3. 1 Peter 3, beginning in verse 1. Oh, I'm sorry, 1 Peter 3:8. 1 Peter 3:1 is good, but we won't go there today. Verse 8, finally, all of you being of one mind, having compassion for one another, love as brothers, be tenderhearted, be courteous, not returning evil for evil or reviling for reviling, but on the contrary, blessing, knowing that you were called to this, that you may inherit a blessing. We are called to act and react in a different way than what comes naturally to us. But it's consistent with God's nature. He wants us to become like him. Now, when we're in a season of trial, the hope that sustains us should be apparent to all. If we drop down to verse 15, of course, this was mentioned earlier. It says, but sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and always be ready to give a defense to everyone who asks you a reason for the hope that is in you with meekness and fear. Why would they ask us about the hope that is in us if there maybe wasn't a reason for us to hope? Now, even though they might not understand or agree with us, because as Isaiah 5:20 says, they call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness. There's a lot of confusion out there. Yet deep down, they still yearn for hope. Every human yearns for hope. And we reflect the hope that the true light of the gospel brings. Sometimes, even though we might not be aware of our effect on others, we do have an effect. I started attending church in the mid-1970s. And if you were alive then in the mid-1970s, you'll probably remember about that time the idea of cults started entering into our consciousness as Americans. There's a lot of coverage in the news where people were actually abducting their children in order to deprogram them because of the psychological abuse they were receiving in cults. Suffice it to say, it was not a good time to leave the religion you were brought up in and seek another religion. And fortunately, the pastor came out to visit with me. My mom was there, and he was able to comfort her a little bit, but still, he was part of that movement. So my mom was an only child, and she had two lifelong friends. She grew up with them. One lived next door, one lived a few doors down. And for all intents and purposes, they were de facto sisters. In fact, I called them aunts. I know aunts is correct, but I gave up on the English language years ago. We called them Aunt June and Aunt Penny. Well, Aunt June lived on the other side of the state, and the western side of Pennsylvania, just above Pittsburgh in a small town called East Brady. And over the hill from my Aunt June, there lived a family. And that family, there was some kind of disability. It's kind of hazy now. It was a long time ago, and I don't know how clear it was when I knew it at the time. But there was some kind of disability within this family. And how they handled that disability impressed my Aunt June. They were also members of the Worldwide Church of God. Excuse me. So when my Aunt June told my mom this, it made my life a lot easier. Now, I was determined to go forward with pursuing this no matter what, but it was just easier not having additional resistance at home. You just never know. What you do, how you act, is going to affect somebody you can't even dream of. In a way, the worse things become, the greater our light because of the contrast between the world that is now and the world to come. A personal example I'll share with you, where we attend in Lehigh Valley, about 3 months ago, we lost a good friend and sister in Christ. My wife and I had known Rita for 30 years, and she had a good job, and she left that job because she wanted to help people, so she became a physical therapist. She loved the outdoors. She was a musician, and she loved Bible study, which obviously led to some great conversation over the years. Anyway, as she got older, she had a chronic issue with her GI tract, and it seemed to get worse as she got older. And then eventually she got cancer in the same area. So once the doctors decided that there just wasn't going to happen, she wasn't going to survive this, she decided, okay, I know it's coming. I'm okay with it. So she removed her tube and she had passed within a week. But those of us in our congregation, she didn't have family other than a brother who had to work. We stayed with her. We spent night with her, visited her. I will tell you that her light at the end of her life, when it was darkest, was brighter than her light previous to that. It's a powerful example to us to have a light shine when it's dark. God doesn't always heal miraculously to show forth his glory. More often, his glory is shown through us by our faithful continuance in the face of adversity. Jesus used a candle as an example of putting a light up for other people to see. You put a light up, you don't cover it. I'm going to jump on that analogy and run with it a little bit, piggyback on it. So I want you to picture a dining room table. People are around it eating a meal. And it's noon, so there's lots of natural light and artificial light. And there's candles on the table and they're lit. How much light do they contribute to that setting? Well, not much. They're more for ambiance than light. Now that same meal is taking place after dark, but there's still artificial light. And the candles are still more for ambiance, although you can kind of see that there is some light being put off by them. Now let the power go out. Now it's dark, except for the candles. And they're bright. They're lighting the room now. They've passed from nice to necessary. It's the same candle that was burning earlier. And no one noticed, really, except for ambiance. The candle didn't up its game when the lights went out. It's the same candle. It's burning the same way. Its effect is much greater because of the darkness that's surrounding it. It's much brighter. Do people see the hope that is in us when things are going well? Well, they might, maybe. But when that hope really stands out is when things are not going well. If those around us see hope and faith when the physical evidence says there is no hope, that stands out. That is a powerful witness we can learn from our three examples. If there's a signature scripture in this message, it is this one. Hebrews 12, verse 28. Hebrews 12, 28. And I'm going to read it, but I'm going to read it in context because this verse starts with therefore, which whenever you see therefore, it's a statement of summation or conclusion. So I'm going to start reading in Hebrews 12, 18, and I'm going to read this in the New Living Translation because sometimes it's just nice to hear it in language that we use every day. So verse 18 of Hebrew 12, you have not come to a physical mountain, to a place of flaming fire, darkness, gloom, and whirlwind, as the Israelites did at Mount Sinai. So this is contrasting Mount Sinai and Mount Zion. Verse 19, for they heard an awesome trumpet blast and a voice so terrible that they begged God to stop speaking. They staggered back under God's command. If even an animal touches the mountain, it must be stoned to death. Moses himself was so frightened at the sight that he said, I'm terrified and trembling. Verse 22 says, no, you have come to Mount Zion, to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to countless thousands of angels in a joyful gathering. You have come to the assembly of God's firstborn children, whose names are written in heaven. You have come to God himself, who is the judge over all things. You have come to the spirits of the righteous ones in heaven who have now been made perfect. You have come to Jesus, the one who mediates the new covenant between God and people, and to the sprinkled blood which speaks of forgiveness instead of crying out for vengeance like the blood of Abel. Be careful that you do not refuse to listen to the one who is speaking. For if the people of Israel did not escape when they refused to listen to Moses, the earthly messenger, we will certainly not escape if we reject the one who speaks to us from heaven. When God spoke from Mount Sinai, his voice shook the earth, but now he makes another promise. Once again, I will shake not only the earth, but the heavens also. This means that all of creation will be shaken and removed, so that only unshakable things will remain. He's saying it's all temporary. It's all temporary. Verse 28, since we are receiving a kingdom that is unshakable, let us be thankful and please God by worshiping him with holy fear and awe. We're temporary residents of a temporary world. Temporary comes to an end, but there are two ways in which temporary can come to an end. I think the easiest way to explain this to you is in a way that temporary means something to me. When I worked in the electrical trade and a new building was put up, we had to run temporary lights. We ran wires through the building with light bulbs on them. Maybe you've passed by a building under construction and you've seen this, these lights scattered all through the building. Because once the interior walls go up and the exterior walls are done, you lose natural light. You need light to see. So we run temporary light. And then the workmen can do their work. And then after the building progresses and the permanent electrical system's installed and the ceilings are done, you can install the permanent lighting. And then the day comes that you'll energize the permanent lights, and then the temporary lights have no further use because the permanent has arrived. Just disconnect them, cut them off, and most times they just stay above the ceiling because it just isn't cost effective to remove them. There might be some strings of lights above this ceiling. Don't know. That's the first way temporary comes to an end, when the permanent arrives. That's the kind of temporary we want to be, because we are looking to the permanent. There's another kind of temporary, and another way that temporary ends. And that's like if an event comes to town, like a fair or a carnival or something like that, and they need temporary lights and power for vendors or whatever. We run power while the event's there, and whether it's there a day or a week or whatever, the event ends. There's no need for the power anymore. We remove it, and it's gone because its time is up. That's the second kind of temporary. That is not the kind of temporary we want to be. This feast reminds us to be the right kind of temporary, the kind of temporary where we acknowledge that we are that, but we are looking to the permanent. We have our eye on the future. When we consider what's at stake, is there anything that God would ask of us that wouldn't be worth it? Many people participated in what God is doing. Some endured great trials and tribulations in order to do that, and some still are today, and some will in the future. God will put us in the circumstances he wants us to be in. Now, we might not necessarily choose those circumstances for ourselves. Those conditions in which we find ourselves may be very difficult. It may even seem unfair at times. But like the man blind from birth, or the others we read about earlier, it may be that God needs to use us in the midst of those less than desirable conditions so that his works can be more effectively revealed through us. Therefore, since we are receiving a kingdom which cannot be shaken, no matter our circumstances, no matter where we are in the season of our life, whether we're experiencing good times or bad times, let us have grace by which we may serve God acceptably with reverence and godly fear. Have a great afternoon and a wonderful rest of your feast.